there, and welcome to the Feet of Jesus, where we are going through the entire Bible, one book at a time, and we are in the book of Acts, and we are studying Acts 18. As always, the workbook to this topic is going to be in the description, so you can pull up the link and purchase it if you want to join along with us on the whole journey. So anyway, we're on Acts 18, and the thing I want to start doing is I'm going to start telling you right up front what we're going to learn. And in this lesson, we are going to learn about the sovereignty of God and how he is with us and we do not need to fear. And the second thing we're going to learn is a little bit about friendship and how godly friendships can really be a big help in our world and especially in our life right now, but always. So let's get into Acts 18 so that you can really understand where we are. We are in Corinth. We are in Paul's second missionary journey. Then he goes back home and then he starts his third. And so at the end of his second missionary journey, he goes to Corinth. And we think of Corinth, I think, in these lovey-dovey terms because of the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But that's not really what the town was like. And so let's just get into it a little bit. They were known for a few things. They were known for their bronze works. They were known for the beautiful gate. And that's a term that we see in the Bible. We hear about the gate beautiful or the beautiful gate. And obviously it was beautiful. We also know that they were good with sports, architecture. We can still today hear people refer to Corinthian columns. That is from back then, from Corinth. All of that is wonderful. But one thing that Corinth was really known for is their immorality. They were a party town. If I had a picture, I would love for you to look at a picture, just Google image a picture of Corinth. In the picture of Corinth, there's this mountain. And on the mountain, there was a temple of Aphrodite. And in the temple of Aphrodite, there were 1,000 priestesses. Basically, these were religious prostitutes. So they would come down to the town and people would give them money for services. And it was horrible. So people went to Corinth kind of for one thing, for the priestesses, for their services, for the partying that they would be able to do. There's a lot of places in this world that can be compared to that. I went to one of them just this last January and February, and I can tell you, I have a different picture of Corinth now because of the traveling I've done and I've seen. I'm sure there's plenty of people here that are watching this that understand what I'm talking about. There's a level of heaviness when you go to one of those cities that I think is due to the evil that's allowed to be there. So that is what Corinth was like. And I promise you, after knowing that, you're going to read 1st and 2nd Corinthians with a different perspective and possibly a more effective perspective than maybe what you've read it in the past. So anyway, while he's there, Paul always starts his time in a new city in the synagogue first. And the people in the synagogue, we're going to learn in our first lesson that we're going to read, are just horrible to him. And so he shakes them off and he says, I'm now going to the Gentiles. Early on in Corinth, he meets some lifelong friends who are Aquila and Priscilla, and they go on to be so helpful in his life. And they are just one amazing, cool couple that I hope to emulate in my lifetime with me and my husband. But Aquila and Priscilla are awesome people. So anyway, he meets them. He has this time in the synagogue, and then he decides to go to the Gentiles, and he spends a year and a half in Corinth talking to the Gentiles. Then he decides he really needs to go back to Antioch, where the disciples are, and kind of debrief. On the way there, he stops in Ephesus, and for the first time, people want him to stay. So he has had more trouble with people wanting him to stay. He's been stoned, he's been beaten, he's been imprisoned, and he finally has a town that wants him to stay. And he goes, no, I'm so sorry, I have to go home. But he says, I will be back. So he goes home to Antioch, and then he comes back and sticks to his word. And Ephesus is the first part of his third journey. And so we will start to understand Ephesus, but we will just touch on Ephesus. And next week, we're going to get more into Ephesus. So that's where we are in Acts 18. And so what do we want to learn specifically? Let's get into our verses. The first lesson that we are going to work on is Acts 18:6. So this is Acts 18:6. But when they resisted and blasphemed, these are the Jews in the synagogue, he, Paul, shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. So, blasphemed. I know we kind of know what that means, but it means to speak evil. So these people weren't just challenging Paul. I believe they were speaking evil. They were doing awful things, and Paul used their own, we talked about it earlier when we were studying Luke, about how they wouldn't even want their cloaks to get onto Gentiles. You know, they would pull their cloaks into them so that their cloaks wouldn't even touch a Gentile if they were walking down a street. That's kind of where we are on this. So he's just shaking the dust off of him. He's using their thing against them. He's saying, I don't even want your dust on me anymore. I'm done with you. And he goes to the Gentiles. And so let's stop there for a minute. I think what this helps me see is that Paul knew the moment when it was okay to move on. He knew the moment that it was okay to shake off the feet from the people that he was trying to witness to, and to move on to talking to the new people that God was wanting him to talk to. So I think we need to stop there and realize that it really is okay sometimes to stop witnessing to people that God is moving us away from. And that's hard, because I think as Christians, we tend to want to stay there and stay there and stay there and until we can make our point understood. But Paul was weary. I think Paul was a little bit tired at this point. And God was saying, it's okay. Move on. And Paul understood that it was okay to move on. So every once in a while. Now, how do we know that? Prayerfully. We know that by listening to God's word. We know that by praying. We know that by hearing God speak to our heart and our soul. You can't just decide, I'm tired, I'm done. Paul didn't decide that. Paul still talked to them, even though when he was tired. And when they spoke evil, he knew it was time. It was time to move on and talk to the Gentiles. So, prayerfully, if you have been witnessing to someone and they still speak evil to you, they still speak against God, prayerfully decide between you and God when it's time to move on to someone else. I think that's just a little lesson that we can learn here. So, the next verse that we're going to look at is Acts 18:9 and 10. So this is what it says. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. This is a loaded verse. It is so cool. I've really been hit by a phrase that was given to me by a couple friend of ours, Gail and Lyle McDaniels. So shout out to them if they're listening. But one time, a long time ago, Lyle spoke up and said, you know, God's either sovereign or he's not. And I have to be honest, I was much earlier in my Christian walk when he said that to me. And I was like, well, but he is. Why would you? I didn't get it. What he's saying is God is sovereign. So we need to live as though God is sovereign. That's what God is telling Paul right there. Paul, I've already told you, Paul is weary. Paul is tired. He has been beaten. He has been stoned. He has been spit upon. He's tired. And he gets to this town and he must have, for the first time, been a little bit discouraged. And God is saying here in these verses, in Acts 18, Paul, I'm with you. I'm going to protect you. I am here. You are not going to be hurt in this town. So what can we learn? We have got to live as Christians with the daily, I talk often that we have our head knowledge and we have our heart knowledge. I think as Christians, we know up here that God is sovereign. We need to transfer that to our hearts sometimes. I know that we are dealing with weird times. Many of us are having this second surge of the coronavirus. I am not saying don't be careful. I think we do need to be careful. I think we need to follow guidelines of people that we believe are putting their time into researching this whole virus. But we should not live afraid. We need to live knowing that God is sovereign. I had a big decision that came up this week, and I've actually been studying Genesis a lot this week, and there's this phrase where a little portion of scripture where Jacob is actually wrestling with God. And oh my gosh, it hit me right here and right here all at the same time. Heather, you're wrestling with God. Don't allow yourself to wrestle with God. I repented right then and there. And I said, God, I surrender. I am not wanting to wrestle with you. How do you know you're wrestling with God? You have this feeling about a situation or situations or things that are going on in your life. If things are going on that are just making you weary and yucky, you might be wrestling with God. And taking our Acts 18 verse, you may need to realize that God's got you. God isn't one that we should be wrestling with. He's one that we should be grabbing onto. I had to learn that this week. And once I realized that, I was like, oh yeah, you're good. You've got this. You're in control. I need to trust you. So that's what we need to do. We need to live life as Christians knowing that God's got this. It's my tagline every time. And I'm amazed at how many verses bring me right back to that point. I've probably brought it up in all of these videos in Luke and in Acts. I've probably brought it up a couple dozen times because that is one of the big pillars of our whole faith, isn't it? Okay, so last verse we're going to talk about is the last verse in this grouping of verses. So it's Acts 18:26, and this is what it says. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the ways of God more accurately. So he in this verse is Apollos, and Apollos is a unique guy. One day when we get to Hebrews, it's kind of interesting. Hebrews is written in a much more formal form of Greek. You may already realize that nobody really knows, and we won't know until we get to heaven, who actually wrote the book of Hebrews. But there's a little bit of evidence that it might be Apollos. So he's an interesting dude, really good guy. What we're going to study here is friendship and how friends can help us. So let me explain who Apollos is a little bit. Apollos shows up right about here, right here, and he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but he only knew about Jesus through Jesus's baptism of John the Baptist. Well, vice versa, of John the Baptist's baptism of Jesus. And so he knew about him there. And he believed in Jesus so much just through that tiny bit of the story that he was teaching about Jesus in the synagogues. Well, Aquila and Priscilla pull him away and start teaching him about the whole story of Jesus. And Apollos makes a huge impact in Ephesus. And so let's talk about friendships here for a minute. First of all, friendships in the faith are important. They're so vital. I have been wanting to talk to people about this whole time away from churches. I think it's done us some harm. Remember, we've talked over and over again about how the church is not the building, it's the people. And through this virus, I think we've had a lot of time away from the church. Even as we've been starting to come back to the building, there's still a lot of people that are not coming. And I think coming together as a body of believers is really important, because as a body of believers, we get to depend on each other. We can love each other. We can support each other. We can teach each other, and we can be teachable with each other. That's the lesson we're going to learn here. We need believers in our lives. Yes, we need to be salt and light as well. So we need to have friends that are not of the faith that we are investing in, but we need to have friends in the faith that we are counting on. Paul counted on Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos. And those friends made a difference in our faith today. We don't know about those three too much. We know a lot about Paul and not about those three very much, but those three made a difference in our faith today. So how are you going to make a difference in the faith? One thing that this verse talks about is being teachable and being a teacher. I love being a teacher through this. I love talking to people about the faith. I love researching the verses and getting the little details out and learning what we can learn from each other. I love that. But I'm not always excited about going to someone who I think might be misunderstanding a point. I'm not real good at that. But Aquila and Priscilla had the courage to do that with Apollos. And because they had the courage to do that with Apollos, Apollos was better equipped with the rest of the story about Jesus and about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ that made him Son of the living God. And he made a difference in the faith. You know, because Aquila and Priscilla had the courage to teach a friend, a person that didn't know the whole story, they were able to help someone who made a difference in the faith. So we need to have the courage to help a friend know that maybe they need to think of it this way. That's okay. And then also we need to be teachable. It's easy to be defensive if someone is telling us we don't know quite the whole story. I'm just going to ask you just to take it in. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. Take it in. Research it yourself. We learned about that with the Berean church, didn't we? Take it in, research it yourself, and then come back and decide with God what is truth. So be teachable. So friends, oh boy, you know, there's some things we could learn here. There is a time when it's okay to walk away from a witnessing opportunity. And that time is only decided between you and God. There is, what did we learn in the second verse? Oh my goodness gracious. God is either sovereign or he's not. There's no room for fear in our faith. and no room for wrestling with God, but that's in another book that we're going to learn and learn soon, by the way. And then friends. Friendship is so important, my friends. And you know what? I really think of all 85 of you as friends. And so as far as 85 goes, you know what? I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe if you're not a subscriber. If you are a subscriber, if you would share this with one friend, and we will get this moving and grooving. And what are we going to put at Jesus' feet today? We are going to put our godly friendships at Jesus' feet. We are going to put those times when God is going to tell us we need to be teachable, when we need to teach a friend. We are going to put those times when we are fearful at God's feet, and we're going to let him be sovereign. And lastly, we're going to put at Jesus' feet those times when we need to have him help us know when it's okay to move on and witness to a different friend. So friends, thank you for being with us. And as always, put your faith in God's hands, because God's got this. Love you, friends.